Welcome to the Sermon in the Valley with Pastor Rob Eller. You can find this podcast on Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and YouTube. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to the podcast on any of those platforms and share it with your friends and family. Thank you. Welcome back to the Sermon in the Valley. Pastor Rob Eller here with your Monday sermon episode with the readings and sermon from Sunday, November 10th, the 25th Sunday after Pentecost. Let's get started. A reading from the 17th chapter of 1 Kings. The word of the Lord came to Elijah, saying, "Go now to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and live there. For I have commanded a widow there to feed you." So he set out and went to Zarephath. When he came to the gate of the town, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and said, "Bring me a little water in a vessel so that I may drink." As she was going to bring it, he called to her and said, "Bring me a morsel of bread in your hand." But she said, "As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of meal in a jar, and a little oil in a jug. I am now gathering a couple of sticks, so that I may go home and prepare it for myself and my son. Then may we eat it and die." Elijah said to her, "Do not be afraid. Go and do as you have said, but first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me, and afterwards make something for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of meal will not be emptied, and the jug of oil will not fail until the day that the Lord sends rain on the earth." She went and did as Elijah said, so that she, as well as he and her household, ate for many days. The jar of meal was not emptied, neither did the jug of oil fail, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by Elijah. The word of the Lord. The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 12th chapter. As Jesus taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes, who like to walk around in long robes, and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. The poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which were worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to him, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance. But she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." The Gospel of the Lord. I heard a story recently about a man named David, who had always prided himself on his independence. He was a skilled carpenter, building furniture that people admired and bought eagerly. His craft brought him a good income, and he enjoyed the feeling of being self-sufficient. He felt proud that he had made a good life for himself. One day a devastating storm swept through his town, flooding his workshop and destroying much of his equipment. His tools were rusted beyond repair, and the materials he had stored were ruined. Suddenly he found himself with no way to make a living, and for the first time in years, he felt utterly helpless. Every bit of his independence, his confidence, had been stripped away. David tried to repair what he could, but he soon realized he couldn't do it alone. Reluctantly, he reached out to his church, humbly explaining his situation. To his surprise, people rallied around him. Friends, neighbors, and even customers chipped in. Some bought him new tools. Some offered him temporary work. And others simply listened to his worries, encouraging him to lean on God during this difficult time. Slowly, David rebuilt his workshop, but something had changed in him. He realized that his strength had not come from his own independence, but from God, who provided through the kindness of others. He recognized that humility and dependence on God had opened doors he couldn't have imagined. Today's readings highlight a powerful transformative theme: the deep reliance on God and the humility required to place our trust in Him, especially when it feels uncertain or even risky. Throughout Scripture, we see that faith is not simply a passive belief, but an active, courageous response to God's call, even when it defies conventional wisdom or societal expectations. This trust invites us to let go of self-reliance, opening our hearts to God's guidance and His ability to work in unexpected ways. One striking aspect of this theme is how God often chooses to reveal His strength and provision through those whom society might deem weak, insignificant, or unworthy. These underdog characters, whether they are the poor, the marginalized, or those with seemingly lesser status, become conduits for God's grace. By elevating them, God subverts human ideas of power and success, showing that His kingdom operates on principles of mercy and humility, rather than privilege and prestige. Through these examples, we're reminded that God's view of worth is vastly different from the world's. He sees potential where others see limitation, purpose where others see failure. We start with a tale of two widows, both with not much to their names, both hearts overflowing with faith. In 1 Kings, Elijah, God's prophet, is sent to Zarephath, where he meets a widow gathering sticks to prepare what she believes will be her last meal. She has nearly nothing: a small handful of flour, a little oil, and some wood to make a final loaf of bread for herself and her son. For them, this meal is not simply food. It represents the last bit of hope, the only thing she has left to cling to. When Elijah arrives and asks her first to make a small cake for him before preparing food for herself and her son, his request may seem bold, even insensitive. Here is a woman who is on the brink of starvation, who has nothing left, and Elijah is asking her to give away what little she has. Yet Elijah's request comes with a promise from God. If she trusts and provides for him, her jar of flour and jug of oil will not run out until the day God sends rain upon the land. This widow, who seemingly already lives on the margins of society, faces an extraordinary choice. She could cling to the little she has left, prioritizing self-preservation in the face of overwhelming need. Or she could place her faith in the promise of God's provision, risking her last resources on an uncertain outcome. The stakes couldn't be higher. Her choice is not simply about food. It's a matter of life and death. A test of faith and trust in a God she may not fully know. In her vulnerability, the widow chooses faith. She chooses to give out of her poverty, to trust in Elijah's promise, and to place her hope in a God who sees and provides. This act of giving, small as it may seem, opens the door for God to work miraculously in her life. Her jar of flour and jug of oil do not run dry, and God sustains her family through a time of extreme drought and famine. In Mark, Jesus observes people contributing to the temple treasury, and his attention is drawn to a poor widow who, amidst the many wealthy donors, gives 2 small coins, insignificant by the standards of those around her. Yet despite the modest amount, Jesus honors her gift above all others. He points out that while the wealthy contributed from their surplus, the widow gave all she had to live on. Her gift, though small in value, was immeasurably significant in the eyes of Jesus. What makes the story so powerful is not the size of the offering, but the heart behind it. The widow's sacrifice wasn't about wealth or how much she could afford to give. It was about total trust in God's provision and a willingness to surrender all she had. She didn't hold back or try to keep a little for herself as the wealthy might have done. Instead, she gave what she had left, believing that God would care for her needs. In her act of giving, we see a profound expression of faith. A faith that God would provide for her even though she had little to offer. Jesus contrasts the widow's sacrificial giving with the actions of the scribes, who were highly regarded in Jewish society. The scribes were not only skilled in interpreting the law, but they also sought honor and recognition from others. They were known for exploiting the vulnerable, such as widows, while seeking the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. Their behavior was motivated by a desire for status, rather than a true desire to serve or honor God. In contrast, the widow's gift was not for status or recognition. She didn't give to be seen or praised, but out of a pure heart of devotion and trust in God. This makes her offering far more valuable in the eyes of Jesus. Okay, so based on those stories of the widows, we know how we're supposed to act and what we need to do, but who benefits from what we do? Psalm 146 praises God as the helper of those whom society often overlooks and disregards: the oppressed, the hungry, the prisoner, and the stranger. In this psalm, the psalmist contrasts the fleeting nature of human power with the eternal, unchanging nature of God's justice and mercy. Human rulers and leaders may promise much, but their plans ultimately fade. Their power crumbles, and their influence is only temporary. In contrast, God's reign is everlasting. His commitment to justice and mercy is unwavering. This psalm is a reminder that human leaders and systems of power often fail to uphold justice in a meaningful way, especially for the marginalized. We see this throughout our history of oppression, inequality, and injustice, where the voices of the poor, the orphan, and the widow are silenced. True hope and security cannot be found in the fleeting things of this world, because while these things may seem to offer security, they're often temporary and unstable. Yet God is different. His care for the vulnerable is not just a passing interest, but a deep, abiding commitment. He sees those whom the world overlooks and elevates them with his grace and compassion. God's heart is especially for those who suffer, whether due to poverty, injustice, or isolation. And he works through his justice, mercy, and compassion to right the wrongs done to them. One of the most significant aspects of Psalm 146 is its emphasis on God's concern for those whom society tends to neglect: the poor, the orphan, the widow, and those in prison. These groups, often seen as powerless in human society, are seen as precious in God's eyes. When society's systems fail to care for those people, God steps in, offering justice, mercy, and provision. This is not a theoretical concept, but something that God actively lives out through his actions. He is the defender of the weak, the rescuer of the oppressed, and the provider for the hungry. We often think in terms of what we give, not how or why we give, but these readings challenge us to rethink that. It's easy to think of generosity in terms of large sums of money or visible contributions. But Jesus reveals that true generosity isn't measured by how much we give, but by the willingness to trust God with what we have, no matter how little it may seem. It's about surrendering ourselves and our resources to God's will, acknowledging that everything we have ultimately comes from him. Do we give out of abundance when it feels comfortable? Or do we also give when it requires sacrifice? Are we holding back, fearful of losing what we have? Or are we willing to step out in faith, trusting that God will provide? Generosity in the eyes of Jesus is not about giving what we can spare, but about giving what we have with a heart of gratitude, humility, and trust. The widow of Zarephath barely had enough food for her and her son, but she still fed Elijah. And the widow Jesus saw gave everything she had. In this way, the widow's offerings become a model for us all. It calls us to evaluate the ways we engage with God in the world around us, not just in terms of physical resources, but in terms of all that we are. Are we holding back in any area of our lives, afraid to give all that we have to God? Or are we trusting that in our vulnerability and our sacrifice, God will show us His faithfulness and provision? Are we helping everyone? The stranger, the foreigner, the orphan, the widow, the hungry, the oppressed, as our psalm calls us to do. We are at a pivotal point in our society where we must make a choice between looking out only for our own self-interests or using what we have, not just our surplus, but everything we can, to lift up those struggling and often ignored by society. In our world today, where economic divides grow wider and societal inequalities persist, this choice carries profound implications. We can either continue to build walls around our own comfort and security, or we can extend our resources, time, and compassion towards those on the margins, the poor, the immigrant, the outcast, and all who are vulnerable. This call to serve and sacrifice is not merely a matter of charity, but of justice and love. When we recognize everything we have is a gift from God, it challenges us to look at our resources differently. Our wealth, skills, and even our time are not only for our own benefit. They are entrusted to us so that we can make a positive impact on the lives of others. God calls us to steward what we have in a way that reflects His love and care for all people, especially those who are overlooked and oppressed. This choice is also deeply countercultural. In a society that often glorifies self-interest, independence, and personal success, we are encouraged to put ourselves first, to accumulate and preserve our wealth, and to measure our worth by what we own. But Jesus teaches a different way, a way that values selflessness, generosity, and sacrificial love. This path asks us to look beyond what is comfortable and to be willing to share not only our excess, but also the things we hold dear, trusting that God's provision is enough for all. Choosing to lift up those on the margins means entering into their struggles, standing in solidarity with those who have been left out, and using our resources to address the systematic issues that contribute to poverty, exclusion, and injustice. It requires us to see our neighbors not as strangers or burdens, but as people who bear the image of God, who deserve dignity, opportunity, and care. When we do this, we are embodying the values of God's kingdom, a kingdom where the last shall be first, where the humble are exalted, and where all are welcomed at the table. At this pivotal point in history, our choice can become a powerful witness to the world. By choosing compassion over self-preservation, generosity over accumulation, and justice over indifference, we are participating in God's transformative work. We are living out the gospel in tangible ways, becoming agents of change and hope in a world that desperately needs it. In the end, the choice to lift up those in the margins is about more than charity. It's about creating a community that reflects God's heart for justice and compassion. It's about choosing to live in a way that honors the dignity of every person and challenges the structures of inequality and exclusion. As we step into this choice, may we be reminded that when we give, when we serve, and when we lift others up, we are not diminished. Rather, we find ourselves part of a larger sacred story, working alongside God to bring healing, hope, and justice to a world that is yearning for His love. And all of God's people said, Amen. As always, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to this podcast. Please share this episode, share this podcast with your friends and your family, anyone who needs to hear the good news of God. Let's spread this good news for everyone to hear. The Sermon in the Valley is written and produced at the Patrick Stevens Broadcast Studio, here in the heart of the Tuscarawas Valley. God's peace and love be with each and every single one of you. Have a blessed day.